We learned from the previous lessons that a Java program is written around its data, and that programs are made up of classes which in turn defines those data and the code that manipulates it. However, we don't know how to define structures to contain those data. That is where variables comes in. A variable is a temporal basic data holding entity in a Java program. What this means is that variables are like containers in a Java program where we store different types of values. Assuming you want to store details like names or data like age of a person or salary of an employee or different things in Java, we'll have to put them or store them in a variable. So to use a variable in Java, it follows the process of variables creation and inserting the values into the variable that is created. So variable creation is termed declaration, while inserting values into the variable is termed initialization. So the overall general formula for creating variables in a Java program is this. So you have to use the data type and the identifier. So to create a variable in Java and add value to it, you use the second formula. Data type plus the identifier equals some value. So the data type is nothing more than data types that we have learned before. So if you don't know, you can go back and watch that video from this course series. Okay. So the data type is preceded with an identifier, then the assignment operator equal to, and then some value. So let's take a look at an example. Here is an example. In this example, we created a variable named first name, and we are storing the value Emmanuel in it. So string is the data type here, and first name is the identifier, while Emmanuel is the value we are inserting into this variable. So this is basically how you create a variable in Java. There are three types of variables differentiated by scope, accessibility, memory, and the static keyword. So these are the basis by which variables are categorized in Java: the scope, the accessibility, memory, and the static keyword. So let us take a look at what these things are. The scope of variables in Java is denoted by a block of code, and the block of code is created by an open curly brackets and a closed curly brackets, just as we see in a class, a method, a constructor, an instance block, or a static block. So the scope defines visibility and a lifetime of a variable in a Java program. So as we have seen from the previous lessons, we see that we defined a class scope with an open curly bracket and a closed curly bracket, and we also defined the scope of methods, especially the main method, with an open curly bracket and a closed curly brackets. So that is what a scope actually is. Then what is accessibility? Accessibility defines access to variables. Accessing variables can be done using the class name, or by objects, or directly. So now we already know what scopes are. When we define variables in each of these scopes, we should be able to access those variables that we define in those scopes. So accessibility tells us the different ways by which we can be able to access those variables that we define in those scopes. So how about memory? How does memory classify variables? Memory defines storage locations for classes, objects, and variable data in the JVM memory. So there are two various memories that there are in the JVM. We have the stack and the heap memory. So these memory locations form the basis of categorizing variables in Java, because some variables are stored in the stack memory, while some variables will be stored in the heap memory during the program execution. So the static keyword is just as the name sounds, the static keyword. So you have some variables that are denoted with the static keyword and some variables that are not denoted with the static keywords. This forms the basis of classifying variables also. So based on this basis, we have three different types of variables. And the three different types of variables are local, instance, and static variables. The local variables are those defined within the scopes in a class, while the instance variables are those defined within the class scope, and they are not statically defined. While the static variables are those defined within the class scope with a static keyword. The local variables are those defined within scopes in a class, and we already know what scopes are. So in Java, we have the constructor scope, the class scope, the method scope, and the block scope. So the variables that are defined within these scopes are those we call the local variables. Now, how about the variables that are declared inside of the class and not within those scopes? So the instance variables are the variables that are defined within the class scope, and they are not statically defined, while the static variables are those defined within the class scope with a static keyword. So what this means is that the local variables are those defined within scopes that are defined inside of a class, while the variables that are defined inside of the class are divided into two, the instance and the static. So the variables that are marked with the static keyword are those we call the static variables inside of the class, while those that are not defined with the static keywords but inside of the class are those we call the instance variables. So let us take a look at these concepts in practice.